Welcome to the NFCP podcast. Yeah, I feel like I'm getting tongue-tied already. It's Friday. And this is a series by the Network for Financial Crime Prevention, where we explore the evolving landscape of financial integrity, risk management, and responsible business conduct. Today, we're super fortunate to be joined by Patrick Nates, who is the CEO of VECTRA International. Patrick leads with a strong focus on business impact and supply chain management, helping organizations gain competitive advantage through responsible practices, transparency, and effective change management. His work is guided by a belief that business can and should be a powerful force for good, integrating innovation, risk awareness, and performance metrics to drive meaningful and sustainable outcomes. In this conversation, we'll explore how companies can build resilience, strengthen compliance, and bring together the worlds of ESG and anti-financial crime, two areas that often operate in silos despite being deeply interconnected. We'll also discuss why many businesses still lack transparency across both shareholder structures and supply chains, and how a holistic approach to risk can help them navigate an increasingly complex global environment. But really quick housekeeping before we introduce Patrick and kind of kick off, is that if you don't already know, the Network for Financial Crime Prevention is for you. It's for the community. So what we do is all for the benefit of you guys to upskill each other in a safe environment. And this next episode is to add a layer to that, because that's something that we haven't covered extensively ever, or just very piecemeal. And that's why I invited Patrick here. We've met a couple of years ago at a conference in Copenhagen, and I just love his passion for ESG work, and he's very engaging in the way he speaks, and I thought he'll be perfect to introduce you to, because he can show us how ESG is important beyond the reporting, and how we could see the connections in our world within the anti-financial crime world and space. If you want to become a member, please go to our website, www.nfcp.info. Follow us on LinkedIn. Our community is constantly growing, and we want to see you there as well. So without further ado, welcome, Patrick, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Louis. It's a pleasure to be here. And wow, what an intro. I'm not sure I can actually now make that come true during our conversation, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have you back if we don't cover it, but I'm sure a lot of people will get some good insights from this convo we'll have today. So let's jump into it. So, you know, Patrick, you often speak about how creating competitive edge through you can create a competitive edge through responsible business practices. But, you know, how do you see this in risk management and business impact becoming strategic differentiators rather than compliance check?
Okay, well, nice question to kick off there, Louis.
We're jumping in.
We're jumping in, exactly. It is a very rapidly evolving landscape. I mean, if you think about how we would look at compliance 10 years ago versus what we're doing today, it is fundamentally different. And so because of that rapid movement, some companies keep up with the times, some companies fall behind, and some companies really kind of haven't even gotten started yet, not really. So for me, it's all about what's the maturity of the organization that you're in. And when you look at different organizations, you clearly can see different levels of maturity. For example, when you look at the web and you look at kind of risk on supply chains, there are dozens of platforms out there that provide these heat maps of risk. But what is that risk really? Actually, it's just an inherent risk. It basically just says, you know, your risk of doing something in that particular part of the world has a risk. But that's not your actual risk, right? I mean, the actual risk is the residual risk. What control mechanisms, what systems do you have in place? How do you look at risk in a multidimensional way that actually determines the real residual risk, the actual risk that you have? Many companies are not there yet. Right? I think also, as I attend board meetings, the dynamic at a board is really beginning to shift from, I'm going to say, risk, okay, we need to have responsibility, so we need to manage it, to value creation. It's about, you know, the flip side of the coin, if you think about it. You know, looking at risk and quantifying risk is a negative exercise. But if you try to, you know, say, okay, if we do this well, we can actually evaluate company at a much higher level. So I think that's beginning to shift around as well. I think technology is coming in really, really fast, right? I mean, we now have loads of predictive models, but then I kind of go, let's pause for a second, right? Because people think that predictive models are like, God's black box, and whatever comes out at the other end, therefore must be true. And I question that kind of approach to life, because at the end of the day, you can have whatever tool that you want. It is about people working together, managing something. Right. So, I step into organization and kind of go, oh, yeah, but we've got this predictive model. Look at this. And then I begin to say, have you quantified it? What are the parameters that go in there? Is the data even verified? And I get blank stares. And then you think about supply chain, because that's my sandbox. That's where I play. Right. And you look at supply chain and you go, a lot of companies still deal with what I would call a one-dimensional view on supply chains. What's my risk of operating in China? And then some president somewhere in the United States started playing a tariff game. And then everybody went, oh my God, China, we need to move. Okay, let's move to Vietnam. Well, guess what? In whatever sector you're in, the capacity of producing in Vietnam is extremely limited. So what's your secondary country? Oh, okay, let's do, I don't know, whatever, furniture manufacturing. Okay, Indonesia. If you haven't looked at those multidimensional risks, by the time that you figure out that you need to go to Indonesia as your secondary backup source, you are too late. Because the guys that are doing better at risk management, that are more mature, they are already in Vietnam before you even think of going to Vietnam. So by the time that you arrive, it's like at a concert. The good seats are gone.
I like that analogy. And I agree with you 100%, right? It's about, having that forward thinking approach, being proactive, and having that lens to geopolitical issues so that you could make those decisions. Like you said before, the crap hits the fan. You could make these adjustments and diversify what you're doing so that you're not trapped. If it does happen the way you perceive it to happen, then you could kind of make judgment calls at that point, but not just make snap judgments and go all in on something when you didn't have the right appropriate time for planning it and other things like that. And it's interesting, you mentioned, close neighbors to China. So even when you're trying to have this, debate of where do you go if you're leaving a jurisdiction, a lot of times, and we're seeing this with Russia, right, that you run into the friendly countries to them. So, or, the fence for them. So meaning, these countries are operating on the behalf of that other country that you're trying to avoid. So it's this tricky game you need to play. But to your point, this is all how risk management gets built into it. And it can be a strategic, but also a competitive advantage if you do it well.
Well, the question is a matter of perspective, right? Do you look at risk or do you look at opportunity?
Yeah, that's true. It's framing the framing of it that kind of takes it from a negative to a positive. So yeah, that's wow, spot on. Pearls of wisdom from Patrick already on the first question. I love it. So kind of changing the dial a bit and the focus into how ESG and anti-financial crime kind of meet. So as mentioned in the introduction, these two disciplines, let's for argument's sake, call them disciplines, have been handled by separate teams, or what people might have, and I think you even might have called them different universes. But why do you think that these functions remain siloed, and what needs to change for a more holistic approach?
I think if you think about those two areas, they fundamentally originate in completely different parts of law as well as with intention. I mean, if you think about anti-financial crime, they really kind of are coming out of financial law and enforcement. And when you think about, ESG particular, then they really kind of come more out of a rights holder, shareholders point of view with regard to expectations, right? Rights holders have certain expectations. In order for shareholders to meet that, they create a kind of a universe of ESG. So they really come from two very different angles. But then when you look at the skill set within those organizations, you're looking at two completely different skill sets as well. You're looking at, in the anti-financial crime area, you're really looking at kind of deep investigative, skill sets, while, when you look at ESG, and particularly the E and S, and maybe I can talk a little bit more about that later, is when we talk about ESG, people really mean ES and the tiny, tiny little G. So you're looking more at, from a real technical point of view, like, a human rights competency. You're not looking at it from, kind of an investigative type of skill set. So they come from two different skill sets. The other thing I think, which is interesting, is that at the very highest level of the organizations, the leadership treats them as two separate areas. And I think it starts right there. I mean, I know it's cheesy to say it always starts at the top. Yes, I understand that. But it's true, right? When you go to board of directors, they kind of go, okay, let's look at our risk. And then there's another topic on the board that says, let's look at ESG. And they go, hold on, it's still talking about risk, right? And there's a significant overlap, except the boards and the leadership teams haven't really gotten to that point yet. And, and hopefully we can get to talk a little bit about that later. Let me give you an example. Recently, I was at a significant event that really kind of dealt with ethics and compliance. And, a few hundred people, I was walking around talking to amazing people. And I said, you do understand that supply chain risk is actually part of ethics and compliance. And I got mainly two different answers. The first answer was, hadn't really thought about that, which was shocking to me. The second answer I got was, yeah, that's true. So then my follow-up question is, so who's dealing with supply chain risk? Oh, yeah, there's somebody in our organization. Don't really know who it is, but, we're dealing with it somewhere. And I think that's the current state of play, right? Even with companies that are kind of operating in both fields, the leadership is not connecting them. And I think that's a really missed opportunity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I see it in a lot of different kind of ways. If I'm putting on my, financial industry hat, the reason why governments apply so much pressure for us to look at the flows of money is because we see the flows of money, right? So
Exactly.
Either if it's pre-transaction, let's say in the sanction space, when you're doing sanction screening, we try to capture sanctions risk, potentially list-based risk. We also look at PEP, a list-based risk, right? But we can also use that to look at some of the other areas you were mentioning, like human rights, supply chain, but we are just not that informed about it, right? So I'm not saying our sanctions teams should handle it, but we should know these red flags or risks so that then we could then escalate it to the right team to review it. And then if you're talking about the transaction monitoring side, right? So they're looking at stuff post-transaction. Again, they need the tools in their tool belt to be able to pick up on these signs on the ESG issues so that they could escalate it to the right team to review it. In my experience, again, working in the financial industry, whenever we talk about export controls, trade compliance, supply chains, I was always told, go to the trade finance team. That's their business. They understand it. What I think management fails to see is that they understand the business angle of it. They don't understand really the compliance of it. And a lot of times they don't understand the risk of it, or because the tone from the top is in such a way that they accept more risk than maybe they should. And that's a detriment to the compliance team because we just don't understand it. So either we're blind to it and just letting things go, or we're super vigilant and we're stopping things that we shouldn't, right? So it goes both ways. There's a pro and con to it.
Absolutely.
So, in talking about kind of these synergies, the way I see it is that there's an education gap. We need to understand what these things are, and not to be an expert, but need to understand what these issues are, what these risks are. And then to the example you gave, know who to talk to about it, right? Know who to escalate it to, know who to partner with to say, we came across this issue when we're doing this type of screening. This is not in our wheelhouse, but because it has stopped for another reason, we have it, or maybe it's on the post transaction side. So we're reviewing these groups of transactions. Help us have the right rationale so that we've addressed this potential risk. Is it really a risk? Is it not? Because at the end of the day, if you get an audit or a regulator comes in and they happen to pick up on some of this activity, they're not going to care to say your team didn't pick it up because it wasn't their problem. No, they're going to say, well, you had the information, you should have done something about it. So I think that's, at least from my standpoint, is key. And that's why I'm so grateful that you're here, because a lot of us who are in this work just don't understand it. And we won't get into all of that today, but I think I just hope that this conversation starts with the kind of path down this knowledge lane so we could get to a space that we could handle these types of risks and concerns.
Absolutely. I hope so as well. That's where we need to drive this.
And, I harp on financial industry because that's my background, but, obviously there's many different companies and different industries that deal with this risk. And, still there's lack of visibility into, shareholder structures and supply chains. This is something you kind of hinted at before. This is a big problem for us. First, the shareholder structures, just because, the lack of opportunity to view the appropriate information, right? We're not maybe given full information. These registries are now being locked down when they were supposed to be free and transparent. So there's kind of a shift there. And supply chains, again, I mean, most of us in the field don't come from a background of trade and export control. So we have a very high level understanding of the supply chain. But luckily in my career, I've been able to work with a handful of people who really understand the export control and supply chain space. And wow, it's just a wealth of knowledge that they have, and, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So, I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, talking about this lack of visibility. What do you see as the biggest risks created by this lack of transparency?
That's a really good question, but maybe we need to back up a little bit. And because you said something and I kind of went, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. But there's always two ways to look at something, right? And very often, so when we look at like ESG and AFC, when we look at those two areas, we can look at how are we different, but we also could look at it, how are we similar? What is it that both functions are trying to do? And when you look at that, both functions actually deal with corporate integrity. So you actually have that in common as a goal. And then you look at what else do you have in common? Well, guess what? Both have to report into the boards. You both have to report externally. You both are using whistleblower mechanisms, to find out the bad actors, etc. So there's actually a lot of it in common. And I touched on this before. My greatest frustration with ESG is that when people throw out the term ESG, they really mean ES. The G is like this tiny little letter that is at the end, and then they magnify it, kind of go, oh, but we also, work in governance. And then I ask them, what does that actually mean? What's governance to you, right? And they say things like, oh, we're looking at, corruption, and we're anti-corruption, we're looking at anti-bribery. And I go, okay, so you're looking at AFC. No, we're not doing that. Okay, help me understand. Then I get that.
Right.
And then, if you really want to zoom out, even before we get into your question, and I apologize to hijack it a little bit, when we think about things like human rights and human rights violations continue to exist and continue to be unaddressed because of a lack of AI. And I say that because when there is so much financial crime that is going on in the supply chain and ESG that people are unaware of. And if they're aware of, maybe they don't want to deal with it, or they don't have the skills to deal with it. Think about conflict minerals coming out of the Congo. The amount of financial crime between the Congo and the electronic device that you are using right now is insanely high. And they're either insanely high for two reasons, because corruption and financial crime happens in the existing chain, or it's not made visible because of financial crime. I'll give you a super simple example. We were looking at the flow of tantalum out of the Congo. We were doing a research project, and I'm meeting in Rwanda with a comptoir. A comptoir basically is a minerals trader. And we're doing this research. And suddenly this man says, I think it will take $100,000 to do this research. And my first reaction is, he's trying to find out how much we're getting paid to do this research. So my response was, no, it's not. And he goes, oh, I'm really sorry. I think it's 200,000. And he puts his hand on his briefcase. And so clearly there's an attempt of bribery there for us to exclude something from our research. And that makes it invisible. And therefore it remains unaddressed. And that is complicity.
Mhm.
And I know I'm now throwing super hard words out here, but because of the lack of AFC in some of the work that we do in ESG, we are complicit to the continuation of some of these topics. Wow, that was heavy. Maybe we need to take a maybe we need to take a pause and maybe look a little bit at your question. So I'm sorry to hijack it, but I did want to say that, we believe that we're crusaders, but in actual fact, some of our crusading is complicit to the crimes that are being committed because of the lack of AFC. You asked about transparency, supply chains, AFC. I think that companies are spending millions of dollars, euros, whatever currency you want to use, in trying to do due diligence in supply chains. And my view of that is that's like driving home at night in a car with one headlight, closing one eye, and trying to get home safely. That is the current due diligence practice. You hope you're going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And the chances that you're actually going to get home in one piece without causing an accident, with only one headlight, completely in the dark, with one eye closed, is very small. And that's a sense of reality that needs to be built in this community of ESG and in AFC. Think about what is the most powerful factor in any economy, in any commercial enterprise. Guess what? Money.
Mm-hmm.
Money talks. And I know it's another cliche, and I know it's, again, very cheesy, but money talks, or reverse, money silences.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're doing this due diligence on a factory, from an ESG point of view, big S, medium E, tiny G. And we kind of go, all right, we know what the risk is of that factory. Do you though? Do you really know what the real risk is of that factory? And my answer is going to be no, you think you do, but I think you're looking at virtual reality. And why do I say that? A couple of simple examples in the last couple of months. The United States has a law called UFPL. Basically, if you manufacture anything in China that involves Uyghurs, that product is not allowed to enter the United States under forced labor. And so we're looking at this factory that is making amazing products in a certain sector, which I won't name, just outside Shanghai. And the factory looks really good. And so we're talking to the American client and we say, how sure are you? We've done the audit, we've been on site. And then I say, let's take it a step further. Let's look at money flows. Let's look at transportation documents. Let's see which transportation companies are being paid to do what. And you do the deep dive, which we're now following the money, right? Which is what AFC is amazingly good at. And guess what? The product is actually manufactured at a sister ghost site that has a lot of Uyghurs. So you think you're okay, but without that additional layer, it's missing the one headlight, it's closing the one eye, you don't really know what you're doing. Another example, we're looking at an agent in Malaysia. And this agent, it's a sourcing agent. This agent has this 5 factories that they're really adamant are amazing at quality. And the client goes, we don't understand. I mean, they're good factories, but why those 5 factories? And I said, but you know what? Let's look at the board of directors. Let's see what happens in those factories when we look at that angle, which again, guess what? AFC. Yeah. Guess what? The chief operating officer of the agent happened to be a shareholder, silent board member in those 5 factories. So again, there's a conflict here. Again, one eye closed. Another client was descaling a factory in Thailand and moving production into Laos.
Mm-hmm.
And there was all kinds of issues around it. And they thought they had a good job and they're working in this new company, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was raised, in the campaign. And we started looking at it. And what happened was that there were multiple corporate veils in place. But in actual fact, the factory that they had descaled from was exactly the same ownership as the factory in the other country. So again, you're thinking you're doing one thing, but in actual fact, you're not, because you are missing that additional layer, which is AFC.
Man, so awesome to hear those examples. And as you said, the AFC angle is clear as day to me, the way you break it down, because if you're talking about the Uyghur or the UFPL, if I'm saying it right, out of the US, when I can't say where, but one of my former employers, I said, hey, I know this is not a sanctions problem, but have we ever asked our clients about their supply chain? Is there any connection to these companies? And the answer I got was, I don't know, maybe we'll get to it, but that's not really our problem. And it's like, well, but yeah, you're right. It's not a sanctions problem, but we should advise the business that they should look into this. Because again, we're not operating, we might not operate in the US, we might not be a US entity, but still, we want to make sure our clients know about this and are, appropriately taking action. Maybe we'll put it on the, to-do list. And I think that's a lot of the problem we face when we talk about these humanitarian issues or human rights issues, is that it gets put on the back burner, like you said, and AFC is the one that kind of lets them down, even though this is our forte, as you put it. And then yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so your former employer says that's not a sanctions issue, but is it though? Of course it's a sanctions issue, because sanctions is not just in the country in which you operate. Sanctions is also about making sure that you don't have any sanctioned partners or sanctioned individuals, right? I mean, we're looking at a company in India and it looks absolutely amazing, on the Russian sanctions. And then you find out that, it's 100% funded by, a sanctioned individual out of Russia. So you think that you're okay in India. Guess what? Again, you're driving home in the dark, one headlight, one eye closed, and you kind of go, I think we're okay. Well, that tree is coming really fast, and I think you should switch on the headlines, drive with both eyes open and avoid that tree before it bites you.
Yeah, I think, you hit the nail on the head, right? Money talks or money silences. And I think that a lot of these companies that will have nexus to these issues prefer to drive with one headlight and one eye closed, because then they could claim that ignorance is bliss. Oh, we didn't know. Instead of doing the right thing and, like you said, having both lights on and both eyes open, because now you're protecting not only your clients, but you're, being kind of thinking larger. You're protecting society at large when you have that holistic mindset and not just, well, we'll see how it goes attitude.
Yeah. No.
And then your example of how, factories shift their locations based on different things, but the complex ownership structures hide, AFC issues. And also, I forgot the exact word you mentioned, but it also kind of reminded me of when we think about sanctions evasion, right? You need a facilitator to help that happen. So you have the person who wants to commit the crime. They can't do it on their own. They might have a lot of will to do it and a great idea to do it, but they need somebody with the veil of, what's the right word? The veil of kind of doing the right thing or having the right business look from the outside, right? As you said before, it looks beautiful, right? They have to be willing to help the bad actor make it happen. And when they act together, then that's when actual evasion happens. And so you need that facilitator in the middle. And I think that's the same thing, as you said, when it comes to the ESG issues that we face in corruption, because you need that middleman to make it happen. Because without that, it just doesn't work. And a lot of people say it's part of that country's culture, but you're making excuses for something that shouldn't happen. Yeah, it could be part of their culture, but it doesn't mean that it's best business practice. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's fine. When people say I operate out of this Southeast Asian country that has the biggest RMG, ready-made garment industry in the world, and I am 100% bribe and corruption free, I look in their eyes and kind of go, I'm not an idiot. I know you're lying. And if you're not lying, then you are the idiot. I'm sorry to be blunt about it, right? And I think what a lot of people, your point about the facilitator, for me, is that a lot of people are looking at supply chain due diligence the way that they look at a restaurant. They look at the storefront, and the storefront looks nice. It's got a nice little menu outside, and they kind of go, yeah, that looks really good. And then they walk inside, and then they have an amazing waiter, and the waiter is the facilitator, and they wait on the tables. But what you really want to see is what happens in the kitchen, right? And nobody looks in the kitchen. They look at the storefront, they get charmed by the waiter, and everything is hunky-dory, and the next day they got food poisoning.
Oh, man, great analogy. And, I think, at least the way I like to think about it is that, as you also mentioned, there are synergies between AFC and ESG. And yeah, you could have buckets of how they're different, but you could also have buckets how they're the same or similar enough. And that's the same thing when you're talking about fraud. And, a lot of people don't consider that a financial crime, but to me it's weird. They are scamming people. It's for financial gain. That's a financial crime. It should be easy to see that. But yeah, and I guess the way I also kind of think about it is some places I've worked try to push sanctions into the AML framework because they're similar. But I think that is also detrimental because sanctions is not the same as AML. So they do have synergies, but is more dynamic than AML. So if you're trying to make sanctions sit in the same framework, then there are things going to be missed. There's going to be chaos, right? So I think the same way with when you're talking about fraud, when you're talking about ESG, yes, we should look at them from a holistic angle because they do have connections that we could pull on those strings and see that we can, use the same kind of approaches to figure out nefarious activity. But I don't think the right approach is to then shove ESG into the AML model because I don't think that's appropriate either. So while we're talking about the synergies, I also want to be clear, at least I don't want to speak for you, but I'm not saying that we should all put it under one bucket because there's different dynamics at play that I think will get lost in translation if we're starting to really shove them together because they have similarities, but they don't really look alike when you're breaking down all the typologies. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think first and foremost, I don't think that you should ever try to combine things for the sake of combining things, right?
Mhm.
Because then a lot of things get lost, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I look at that a little bit more like the medical professional. Right, you've got somebody who specializes in, ear, nose, and throat. Right, so you have an ENT, then you have somebody that is a cardiologist, and yes, they're all medical professionals, and they all are focusing on one thing, which is your health.
Right.
But I would not go to a cardiologist for my sinus problem. That is something that begins to happen when you artificially now say it's all risk or it's all opportunity, depending on how you look at it. Let's all force it together. I think that's a really bad way of working. But what makes, a medical practice function really well with the ENT and the cardiologist and the pneumologist, et cetera, is they all speak the same language.
Right.
They're all medical professionals. They all have a base. And then they specialize and they focus on their specialty. When you come in for a complete holistic diagnostic, you get to meet all of them and they all can talk to each other because they all have the same language. That is not the case in many companies. When I actually force different, risk functions to come into the same room, they simply do not know how to talk to each other.
Right.
Because they use the same word, but for each of those functions, it means something completely different. Yeah. When you talk to an ESG person and you talk about compliance, in their head, that means compliance to a corporate code.
Right, these spreadsheets.
But when you then bring in an AFC person or somebody from ethics and compliance and you talk about compliance, to them, compliance means something very different. And both use compliance and just get lost in translation. I think that's already one thing. I think the other thing is that what's really missing is what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is actually corporate integrity. And corporate integrity is not a compliance thing. And I know that, a lot of people are going to go, yes, it is. And I'm going to go, yeah, but for me, that's the result of something. And it's the result of culture. It's a cultural thing. Do you, as an organization, have a culture that epitomizes integrity? And if that's the case, then that translates beautifully in whatever function that you're going to deal with. Integrity is integrity. Mm-hmm. It's a very black-white concept. You either are or you're not. And now you need to look at the dimensions of what integrity means. And now you have a common framework. I think the other thing that is really missing, frankly, for me is that different functions look at different points in time on a transaction. And that's fundamentally flawed, right? Again, even if you have both headlights on and both eyes open at night, when you drive home, are you for the next mile going to close your eyes completely? No, you're not. The chance you're going to get home safely is just insanely small, right? And so when you look at you have to look at this in a multi-temporal way. You're looking at beginning to do a transaction. You're beginning to engage. You look at it from multi-dimensions. You look at it from a governance point of view, an AFC point of view, an ESG point of view. Then you go into contracting. You look at it at that point. You look at post-contracting. You look at startup of your commercial relationship. during your commercial relationship, when you're beginning to phase out of your commercial relationship, so like responsible exit. And what happens after you've exited? I can tell you dozens of stories where companies are being bitten after they've exited. They kind of go, okay, well, we're done, we're out of there. And then it comes back. Because they haven't looked at the multi-temporal aspect across the multi-dimensions of ESG, AFC, etc., etc. You can get really bitten by having bad AFC, great ESG when you exit, a commercial relationship. And then because you haven't looked at it, what happens after you've exited, you can get bitten from AFC right there. You didn't do your job right. It's still a corporate risk. Sorry, a little bit of passion there.
No, it's great. And it leads into kind of the next question that I had for you was talking about, how when your organizations typically fall short of expectations or what we want. So I think you've already highlighted a lot of that. So thank you for that. But I guess to piggyback on that, I'm curious to know, in your view, what does good due diligence look like? Now in the environment we're in today, but also beyond. What kind of things the people who are watching and listening today could glean from your ideas on that front?
That's hard. That's a really hard question. It shouldn't be, but actually it is really hard. Good due diligence for me is, as I mentioned before, it must be multi-temporal. You need to look at from the very beginning until very much past, the end of something. It must be very multidimensional. You have to look at it from the different angles. I think I talked about a couple of examples where you only look at one dimension and then the other dimension comes in. It must be. In order for that to materialize, it starts with, is it really a cultural thing or is it just an activity? And for me, that's the major differentiator between companies that do well and companies that do. The companies that do well, it's like an ingrained thing in the company DNA. We do things with integrity. And when you begin to do that, you enable the entire organization to challenge whether or not integrity is upheld. And that drives synergies, that drives integration. And then you need to ensure that that gets facilitated with a common language. Because again, as I mentioned, you can bring two different functions together. They use the same words and, they might as well be talking two different languages. That's actually what good due diligence looks like. And then we can talk about everything else. You can talk about policies and procedures and, tools and predictive models. But those are all enablers to the fundamental thing. Is corporate integrity a cultural thing, or is it just something that you do? Have you enabled your entire organization to ask the question, is this okay or not?
I totally agree with that. And the way I've spoken about it before is most companies, I won't say all, but most companies, it's a tick the box exercise, right? It's like, just meet the minimum standard. Let's get that done with. And if we have time, we'll do a bit more. And my analogy is, when you're going to a race, right, you start at the starting line, right? And then there's a finish line, right? So the way I compare it to is the laws and the regulations are the starting line, not the finish line. Some people see that as a finish line. I see that that's the price that you pay to play. Just like when you go to a race, you have to start somewhere, you start the starting line. So the laws and regulations are the starting line. The end, the finish line, that's if I kind of comparing it to what you said, and it's like understanding the spirit of the law and getting to where we should be. So, and that line constantly moves, right? So there's really no finish game because things change, laws change, regulations change, the work you're doing, the typologies you can see changes. So that bar might keep moving, but still your sight is on, okay, we have the integrity to understand what the requirements are, but we need to get to a space where it's part of our DNA and our culture to get it right. And if it takes more time, it takes more time, but it's not a tick the box exercise. So yeah, that's how I see it. And that's, I guess, how I also think of it, is that, we have to understand the rules of the game. And the rules of the game is, not just stopping at the laws and regulations, because what are they? Those are just kind of, here are the basic rules to get this right. The regulator and the laws never tell you exactly what to do. because if you do something wrong, then you're going to point to it and say, hey, wait, but you told me exactly what to do and something still happened. So now you're transferring the issue to somewhere else. So I think you get the guidelines, you get the structure, but it's up to you to have that integrity to take it the next step forward.
I'm glad that you expanded on your start line and finish line, because so far you and I have agreed on most things. And I was just going to say, well, I actually disagree with the start and the finish line. For me, rules and regulations are too late, too reactive. The regulator never puts anything in place unless the problem is so big that, the regulator feels that they need to do something about it. And if you come at it from we will comply with the law, you already have a significant risks in your organization that you haven't addressed until the law comes out. So for me, there isn't a starting line. The starting line, if you want to maybe take a slightly different analogy, your starting point is a point of culture. Do we or do we not want to be an organization with corporate integrity? That's a decision that you make. That is something that you embed in your culture. And then you work the issue. And when the law comes out, because you're working the issue, it shouldn't be a big deal because the law is always, 10 years late. Because again, the regulator needs to go through a political process reacting to something that is now big enough for them to deal with. Right? And then you continue. So for me, it's more like a spiral upwards, and your point is a culture, and then you just spiral. And when the laws come in, well, it's fine. You're on your continuous, integrity, turning risk into opportunity, and therefore creating, a higher value for you as an organization.
Right. I love that analogy. And thank you for calling me out on that, because now hearing that, it's like, yeah, you're right. It shouldn't be the starting line. But yeah, that's another pearl of wisdom. So before go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to say something super nasty now, right? Because it is a reality in business at the moment, is that unless it really is fundamentally part of your DNA, compliance becomes a one-dimensional financial exercise. And that demonstrates that it's not part of your integrity as a culture, right? Let me give you an example. Large US company has a department of about 8 people. They pay these people an annual salary in total of slightly over $1 million. Then somebody comes in and goes, but if we were to get fined by the regulator, that would cost us a couple of $100,000 a year. So why are we paying $1 million to avoid fines of a few $100,000? And the decision was to fire the entire compliance department. And that is a super ugly example, but a reality in many organizations, how companies are compartmentalizing and looking at it through a one-sided financial dimension lens. That, ladies and gentlemen, and dear Louis, will bite that company big in the future. But that's a decision they've made.
I agree. Is the short-term gains over long-term stability, I say. And I agree with you. I've seen it at both in the US and now living in Europe, where, a company gets into trouble, they ramp up the compliance teams. When they get out of trouble, they let go of a lot of the teams, but they haven't found a happy medium. It's just this large ebb and flow of in trouble, out of trouble, in trouble, out of trouble. And to me, it's very short-sighted, because if you find a better baseline, then you don't need these high peaks and valleys, because as you said, you're prioritizing staying ahead of the game and being proactive instead of just being reactive.
If you were to look at this from your ebb and flow, the way that you said it, which is beautiful. If you look at it from a total cost point of view, that is a financial disaster. The amount of organizational disruption and the cost associated with ebb and flows is detrimental, and no CFO would ever agree with that if they looked at total costs.
Yeah, it's so true. It's short-sighted, as I mentioned, because, they might save, a certain amount over a certain amount of years when they reduce the headcount. But then when you're talking about having to then go up again, you're talking about paying the recruiters to find the people. You're paying to onboard the people. They're not going to be fully operational for a few months, right? They have to learn the policies and procedures and the risk tolerance. And then when they're fully operational is maybe about, 6 months to a year in. So now you're behind the 8 ball. But and they have to learn the business and the institution they work for, right? But they don't plan all that in. It's just that they see the, amount, the dollar signs or whatever currency you're talking about. And I agree, it's so short-sighted, because if you total all of that up, what they're really spending is astronomical instead of having a better baseline.
Yeah, and you haven't even included in that, the disruption on the other functions, where you now have to say, oh, now you have a new colleague, okay, let's start working together. Oh, well, you've never done it before in the last 5 years. So now the new function has to lobby, another function in the organization. And think about all of that time that is being spent on ramp up. And then when it gets established, they kind of go, oh, we don't need it anymore. So now there's a ramp down. So now the other functions go, wait a minute, I used to rely on my colleague over there. Oh, that doesn't exist anymore. So now again, you have corporate disruption. It's just insanely expensive from a total cost point of view.
Yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, I mean, we digressed a bit, but super informative. But so thank you for taking us there. But as we're ramping, as we're getting toward the end of this conversation, I guess, before the last question is, do you think that ESG ratings and assessments properly incorporate financial crime risk, or are these still very separate conversations?
They're different conversations, not even in the same room, not even in the same house. I think they're actually happening in different cities. When you look at ESG ratings and reportings, there is not a single touch of, financial crime or the financial crime prevention in there. Now, again, I'm going to go back to, my analogy, driving in the dark, one headlight, one eye. That's actually what an ESG report looks like, right? And conversely, also within AFC, you are doing something, but you are not bringing in other dimensional risks into that, right? Because you're not looking at what actually is the financial risk associated with dealing with a supplier that actually could be a PEP, or, could be a crime lord, or, even, have paralegal operations by, taking the money out of it and funding the Israel cause or the Palestinian cause. I don't want to take sides here. Or, just buying arms for the conflict in the Congo. You have no idea. You think that you're dealing with this amazing company in Swaziland, and in actual fact, you're funding a war in the Congo.
Right. And I think, we talked about how we get there, right, with education across the board. And I think what we didn't really touch on is the technology aspect, because now that it's getting so advanced, as long as we have the right data, we can get a holistic view in one place, meaning trying to plug everything into one system, have a holistic view for a customer. It'll take time. And that's something of that, I think I beat to death, is that a lot of institutions don't care enough about their data. And capturing the right information, updating it at the right time. So it'll take time to really integrate all the different parts. But I think that's, utilizing technology to get a more holistic view is definitely part of the agenda, including the upskilling side.
I would somewhat disagree with that.
Really? Okay.
I don't disagree completely. I agree that technology and having really good data, capturing the right data, and looking at systems is a key enabler. But none of the data or the systems will help you unless you are looking at a holistic view in your organization, as or the flip side, opportunity. Right? You can put the most amazing system in place with the most amazing data. But if the functions do not use that system collaboratively in an integrated way to look at a holistic risk, the system can spit out any numbers. If there are, on the other side, people that do not know what those numbers mean, and therefore also collaborate in doing something about those numbers, then the technology will not help. And I don't think that you can create the technology unless you have a more holistic and integrated cooperation within the organization first. Because without that, you would never define the need to have the integrated system.
So true. And that's, a key point. I agree that it has to be built into the workflow. It can't just be the standalone thing, because it won't be useful. And then, that'd be one of the first things that gets cut when that cutbacks happen. It's like, why do we need this tool? Nobody's using it. Let's throw it out. Quick savings.
I refer to that as the health app, right? I'm sure that many of the listeners and viewers have some kind of health app on their phone, right? And they went to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, you're overweight, your cholesterol is too high, do something about it. And they go, okay, I'm getting a health app. And every day they enter their weights and some other data. but they don't make a lifestyle change. And then after about a year, they go back to the doctor, and the doctor goes, well, you're still overweight. Your cholesterol is even higher than you were before. And people kind of go, but I spent all of that time and money on the app. And then they throw out the app, right? It starts with a lifestyle change. Same thing in a company. If you want to look at holistic risk, do a lifestyle change.
That's a great analogy. And it reminds me of something that my friend Paul Cody once said is that, when you're thinking about risk and who owns the risk, right? Because a lot of people don't realize that the first line of the business areas actually own the risk. Is not compliance in the second line. They're just trying to help you avoid pitfalls and the risk. They're trying to be the guardrails. And his example was when you go to a personal trainer, right? Mm-hmm. The personal trainer's job is to say, okay, what can I help you with? Here are things that you can do to help with what you're saying your problem is or what your goal is. But you can't turn around and tell the personal trainer, you know what, today, I don't feel like doing any of this. Can you do it for me? Because then what they're going to say, well, I could, but that's not going to benefit you, right? So that really reminded me of your analogy right there, is that you can't, you have to put in the work to get it done appropriately. You can't just say, well, yeah, I know it needs to be done, but not really changing your culture or changing your mindset to make it happen.
Exactly.
Cool. So, we're down to the last few questions. Unfortunately, I feel like we could talk forever, but I know you got to get back to the grind. But looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenge or opportunity? Because we're talking about looking at it in different lenses, pros and cons, positive and negatives. So challenges and opportunities for businesses trying to align ESG, supply chain transparency, and AFC efforts.
I think the challenge is that the immediate challenge is that we are looking at it in silos, and that's where we started. But even if we were to look at it from a very integrated way, we don't have a common language. We don't have a common understanding of what risk is. The interesting thing for me actually is, and people say we're really good at this, and you've heard me say this in Copenhagen. My first question is, give me a definition of what an acceptable risk is. What is your risk tolerance? And the only thing I get is, the animal steering in the headlights of the oncoming car, which is me, one eye closed, one headlight on. Companies do not have a full understanding of what risk is actually okay as a company and what's not okay. So if you think about it, you don't have a common target. You don't have a common language. You look at it, from very different points of view. These are the challenges. And so these are also the challenges that need to be overcome. And I would say, I know that's super cheesy, but hey, I'm an old man. So there you go. It really does start at the top, right? And it needs to start at the top by not artificially creating the silos. I think boards of directors and C-levels need to ask the question about what is a holistic risk, and not ask the question, what is your risk? And what is your risk? And what is your risk? No, the risk to the corporation is a multiplication between the individual risks. It's not a sum. It's a multiplication. You think that the ESG risk is 5, and you think that the AFC risk is 3, then the total risk is not 8, it's 15, right? So it really does start there. It's what is the risk to the corporation? What's the total risk to the corporation? And that begins to drive integrity. Integrity as a culture. I think that's part of the solution. No. But then I guess you're going to go with, so what can companies do now? Right? Because, I make it super high level. I kind of, cheesy, it starts on the top and this and that, the other. And all of that is true. But this is not, for any of the C-levels that will listen to or see this podcast, this is not an excuse for them not to get started. It takes a long time for a top-down approach, right? So even if a board of directors goes, okay, let's go right now, integrity, this, that, the other. By the time this actually becomes really embedded in an organization, we can talk about years, depending on the size of the organization.
That person might be gone already before it's fully implemented, right?
Could be. I mean, given the volatility in the corporate world at the moment, there are a lot of changes. You're absolutely right. And then the next person goes in and they kind of go, yeah, that holistic approach, then you need to start all over again. So maybe we can go a lot more practical. And a lot more practical for me would be get started in your area by just doing something small, right? If you're an AFC or you're an ESG, start by finding out who's your colleague in the other area. Just go there, right? find out who that person is, have a conversation with that person. I bet you have much more in common than you think. Then a super tiny project, like, pick a supplier. Not a complicated supplier. Don't go into weird areas of northern Myanmar that are linked to China. Don't do that. That's way too complicated. Pick a fairly simple, straightforward supplier. Work together and try to assess what is the real risk of that supplier. Multi-temporal, multi-dimensional. Look at the board of directors. Look at the money flows. Look at this. And I bet you're going to find out things that you kind of go, wow, I didn't know that. And that actually might be the answer for some unpredictable behavior that you've seen in that supplier. Because very often when I talk to procurement people or ESG people, as part of the supply chain, they kind of go, yeah, we got the supplier and the supplier does this, but then, then suddenly the supplier does this and that. And we don't really know why. Maybe that has to do with other clients. The answer is it probably has nothing to do with other clients. The answer it probably has to do with money flows, financials, other influences that you are not aware of. And guess what? Your colleague might have the answer to that behavior. So I would say just start there. Start small, learn about each other, find out who they are, find out. Yeah, the other beautiful thing is that, AFC and ESG have fundamentally different skills. You can really leverage the skill of your colleague in the work that you do, even if it's just to go to them and say, hey, I'm trying to do this from an ESG point of view on that supplier. The AFC person with their massive investigative skill sets, they're going to go, have you thought about this? You can do this. Have you thought about this? Even that will create an instant benefit. I would say just start there.
Great advice. And yeah, a great way to start wrapping up with that pearl of wisdom. Again, much appreciative. Thank you very much for joining us today, Patrick. And thank you all for watching and listening to this latest episode from the NFC podcast. I can't thank you enough, Patrick, for sharing your insights and pretty much a lot of different things on responsible business leadership, supply chain transparency, and the critical convergence of ESG and financial crime prevention. As I said at the outset, if you'd like to learn more about NFCP or get involved in our community, please visit us at nfcp.info. Patrick is also, as you could tell already, a great guy. So if you have any follow-up questions, you could reach out to him on LinkedIn, reach out to his company, VECTRA International. If you want to send questions to me that I could share with Patrick, that's also fine. Put your comments on LinkedIn so he could see it as well. So there's many ways we could continue this conversation offline. So stay tuned for future episodes where we continue to explore issues shaping the future of risk management, compliance, and sustainable business. Until next time, stay informed, stay resilient, keep the lights on and eyes open, stay engaged, and be brave. Thank you very much.